The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Bithynia as Osman Ghazi raised his weathered hand, signaling his warriors to halt. Below them, the Byzantine fortress of Caracahizza stood defiant against the dawn sky, its stone walls seemingly impregnable. Yet something burned in the young chieftain's ear, the vision that would transform a modest Beylik into the mightiest empire the world had ever known. Osman had inherited more than just a small principality from his father. He had inherited a dream whispered by his mentor, Sheikh Edom, who had seen in a vision a great tree growing from Osman's loins, its branches stretching across 3 continents. The year was 1299, and the Byzantine Empire, once the successor to mighty Rome, was crumbling under the weight of internal strife and external pressures. The first test came swiftly, as Osman's horsemen thundered down the hillside, their war cries echoing across the valley. The defenders of Caracahizza realized they faced no ordinary raid. These were not mere bandits seeking plunder, but disciplined warriors fighting for something greater than gold. The fortress fell after a brutal siege, and with it Osman's reputation as a leader who could unite the fractured Turkmen tribes under a single banner. But it was the Battle of Baphius in 1301 that truly announced the arrival of a new power in Anatolia. The Byzantine commander Georgios had gathered a formidable army to crush what he dismissed as another upstart Turkish chief. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the battlefield, Osman deployed his forces with cunning that belied his pastoral origins. The Ottomans struck like lightning. Their mounted archers, descendants of the great Mongol tradition, released volley after volley into the Byzantine ranks before wheeling away like ghosts. When the enemy line wavered, Osman's heavy cavalry charged with devastating effect. Muzalan himself fell in the melee, his death cry marking the beginning of the end for Byzantine authority in northwestern Anatolia. According to historical accounts preserved in the Ottoman chronicles, as referenced in Cambridge medieval history, this victory was more than tactical, it was psychological. Word spread throughout the region that a new champion had emerged, one who could stand against the might of Constantinople itself. Turkish warriors from across Anatolia began flocking to Osman's banner, drawn by the promise of glory and the spoils of conquest. By 1326, when Osman breathed his last, he had transformed his father's modest holdings into a principality that controlled much of northwestern Anatolia. His son, Orhan, knelt beside his deathbed as the old warrior whispered his final words. "My son, I have lit a candle. It is up to you to turn it into a blazing fire." The shepherd's dream had become reality, but this was merely the beginning. The tree of Ottoman power was still a sapling, its roots barely established in Anatolian soil. Greater challenges lay ahead: the conquest of Europe, the fall of Constantinople, and the creation of an empire that would span 3 continents. But first, Orhan would have to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy, and the battlefields of Anatolia would run red with the blood of those who dared stand in his way. The thunderous crash of siege engines shattered the morning calm as Orhan Ghazi surveyed the walls of Bursa from his command tent. The year was 1326, and the young Ottoman leader faced his first great test. Unlike his father's swift raids, this would be a prolonged siege that would either establish the Ottomans as a true power or see them broken against the ancient stones of this Byzantine stronghold. Bursa was no ordinary prize. This jewel of Byzantine Anatolia controlled the vital trade routes between Constantinople and the interior, its markets flowing with silk and spices from the east. For 6 years, Orhan's forces had tightened their grip around the city like a python around its prey. The defenders, led by the capable commander, had shown remarkable resilience, but hunger and despair were taking their toll. When the city finally fell in 1326, the Ottoman victory resonated far beyond Anatolia's borders. Orhan had proven that his father's conquests were no mere flash of tribal fury, but the foundation of a lasting dynasty. The captured city became the first true Ottoman capital, its mosques and schools transforming it into a center of Islamic learning and culture. But Orhan's greatest stroke of genius came not through conquest, but through opportunity. Across the narrow waters of the Dardanelles, the Byzantine Empire was tearing itself apart in civil war. John Cantagezenus, claiming the throne against John Palaiologos, desperately needed military support. In 1340, he made a fateful decision that would change the course of history. He invited Ottoman warriors to cross into Europe as his allies. The first Ottoman soldiers to set foot on European soil were not conquerors but hired swords, fighting for a Byzantine claimant to the throne. Yet as they rode across the fields of Thrace, these warriors were writing the opening chapter of a European empire. Their leader, Orhan's son Suleiman Pasha, possessed his grandfather's vision and his father's strategic brilliance. The Battle of Demotica in 1352 marked the true beginning of Ottoman expansion into Europe. What had begun as assistance to a Byzantine ally had evolved into something far more ambitious. Suleiman's forces, now numbering in the thousands, faced a coalition of Bulgarian and Serbian nobles who had finally recognized the Ottoman threat. The morning mist rose from the Maritsa River as the two armies deployed for battle. The European knights, resplendent in their steel armor, charged with the fury of crusaders, but they found themselves facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered. The Ottoman separatist disciplined cavalry forces, supported by Janissary infantry, fought with a coordination that left their opponents reeling. When the dust settled, the flower Balkan nobility lay dead on the field, and the path to Constantinople lay open. Historical records from the period, as documented in the chronicles of the Ottoman Empire, reveal that this victory sent shockwaves throughout Christian Europe. The Pope himself called for a crusade, but the response was tepid. The great powers of the West were too consumed with their own conflicts. The 100 Years' War raged between England and France, while the Holy Roman Empire struggled with internal divisions. By 1362, when Orhan died, the Ottoman state had achieved something unprecedented. A Beylik that had controlled a few valleys in Anatolia now held territories on both sides of the Danube. The young empire controlled the vital crossing between Asia and Europe, positioning itself to dominate trade routes that had enriched empires for millennia. But perhaps more importantly, the Ottomans had discovered their imperial formula. They were not merely conquerors but builders, creating institutions that could absorb and integrate diverse populations. Their military combined the best of nomadic mobility with settled state organization, while their administration offered opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than birth. As Orhan's son Murad ascended to the throne, he inherited an empire poised on the brink of greatness. The foundations had been laid, the bridgehead into Europe secured. Now came the greatest challenge of all: the conquest of the Balkans and the final assault on Constantinople itself. The war horns echoed across the Maritsa River valley as Sultan Murad surveyed the assembled might of the Balkan coalition. The year was 1360, and the newly crowned Ottoman ruler faced a challenge that would determine whether his empire would become a regional power or collapse under the weight of Christian resistance. Below him, the banners of Serbia, Bulgaria, and Hungary fluttered in the morning breeze, representing the last great effort to halt Ottoman expansion into the heart of Europe. Murad had inherited an empire at a crossroads. His father Orhan's conquests had established Ottoman footholds in Europe, but these gains remained fragile. The Christian powers of the Balkans, finally awakening to the Ottoman threat, had united under the leadership of the Serbian despot Lazar and the Hungarian king, Louis the Great. This coalition commanded respect. Their heavy cavalry had dominated European battlefields for centuries, and their fortified cities had withstood countless sieges. The Sultan's response was characteristically bold. Rather than consolidating his existing gains, he chose to strike deeper into Europe, gambling that decisive victories would shatter enemy morale and open the path to greater conquests. His first target was Adrianople, the ancient city that controlled the approaches to Constantinople. The siege began in 1365, with Ottoman engineers employing revolutionary techniques learned from captured Byzantine specialists. The fall of Adrianople in 1369 marked a turning point in Ottoman expansion. The city, renamed Adarn, became the new Ottoman capital, symbolizing the empire's European ambitions. More importantly, its capture severed the land connection between Constantinople and the Christian kingdoms of the Balkans, isolating the Byzantine capital and making its eventual fall almost inevitable. But the greatest test of Murad's reign came 20 years later, on the field of Kosovo. The date was June 15, 1389, and the fate of the Balkans hung in the balance. Prince Lazar of Serbia had assembled a coalition army that represented the last hope of Christian resistance. The Serbian heavy cavalry, supported by Bosnian and Albanian allies, prepared to make their final stand against Ottoman expansion. As dawn broke over the Kosovo field, both armies deployed with the precision of seasoned veterans. The Serbian right wing, commanded by Vuk Brankovic, faced off against Ottoman sepoys under the command of Bayezid Murad's eldest son. On the left, the flower of Serbian nobility, led by Prince Lazar himself, prepared to charge the Ottoman center where Sultan Murad had positioned himself among his elite Janissary guards. The battle began with a thunderous cavalry charge that shook the earth. Serbian knights, their lances glinting in the morning sun, crashed into Ottoman lines with devastating force. For a moment it seemed the tide might turn against the Ottomans, but Murad's tactical genius soon became apparent. He had positioned his forces in multiple lines, allowing the Serbian charge to exhaust itself against successive waves of resistance. The decisive moment came when Miloš Obilić, a Serbian knight, broke through Ottoman lines and struck down Sultan Murad himself. The Ottoman center wavered as news of their leader's death spread through the ranks. But rather than collapse, the Ottoman army rallied around Prince Bayezid, who immediately assumed command and ordered a general advance. According to Ottoman court chronicles, as referenced in the historical compendium The Rise of the Ottoman Empire, the battle's outcome was decided not by the death of either commander, but by the superior organization and discipline of the Ottoman forces. While the Serbian army was essentially a feudal levy, the Ottomans fielded a professional military machine that could adapt to changing circumstances. When the sun set over Kosovo field, both armies had paid a terrible price. Prince Lazar lay dead among his nobles, while Sultan Murad had fallen at the moment of victory. Yet the strategic implications were clear. Serbian resistance had been broken, and the path to the Danube lay open. The Battle of Kosovo resonated throughout Europe with the force of an earthquake. The last major Balkan coalition had been destroyed, and the Ottoman Empire now controlled territories stretching from the Euphrates to the Danube. Under the new Sultan Bayezid, the empire was poised to strike at the very heart of Christian Europe. But the victory came at a cost beyond mere casualties. The death of Murad I marked the end of an era of patient expansion and the beginning of a more aggressive phase of Ottoman imperialism. His son Bayezid, known as the Thunderbolt, would push the empire to its limits, setting the stage for both unprecedented triumphs and catastrophic defeats. The screams of dying men and horses pierced the morning air as Sultan Bayezid I, known as Yildirim the Thunderbolt, watched the Hungarian cavalry shatter against his Janissary squares. The year was 1396, and the Battle of Nicopolis had just delivered the most devastating blow to Christian Europe since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The flower of Western chivalry lay broken on the Bulgarian plains, their dreams of halting Ottoman expansion buried beneath the weight of superior tactics and discipline. Bayezid had earned his sobriquet through a decade of lightning campaigns that had extended Ottoman dominion deeper into Europe than any previous ruler had dared imagine. Where his father Murad had been methodical, Bayezid was explosive. Where previous sultans had consolidated each conquest before moving forward, the Thunderbolt struck with such speed that enemies had no time to coordinate resistance. The Hungarian disaster had begun with overconfidence. King Sigismund of Hungary, supported by French and German crusaders, had assembled what contemporaries called the Last Great Crusade. The cream of European nobility had answered the cold account of the Marshal of France, the flower of Burgundian chivalry. They rode into the Balkans convinced that their heavy cavalry and superior steel would sweep the Ottomans back into Asia. But Bayezid had transformed the Ottoman military machine into something unprecedented. His Janissary corps, recruited through the Devshirme system from Christian children, had become the most disciplined infantry force in the world. These slave soldiers, trained from childhood in the arts of war and converted to Islam, possessed a fanatic devotion to their sultan that made them virtually unstoppable on the battlefield. The battle itself was a masterpiece of tactical deception. Bayezid had positioned his forces in a series of defensive lines, with his irregular troops forming the front rank. When the Crusader cavalry charged, they easily broke through this first line, convinced they were routing the entire Ottoman army. But this was exactly what the Sultan had planned. As the exhausted European knights pursued what they believed to be fleeing Turks, they found themselves facing fresh lines of Ottoman regulars. The Sipahi cavalry, held in reserve, struck the Crusader flanks, while the Janissaries advanced with their deadly combination of crossbows and early firearms. The result was carnage on an unprecedented scale. The psychological impact of Nicopolis extended far beyond the battlefield. For centuries, European military doctrine had been based on the supremacy of heavy cavalry. The idea that disciplined infantry, supported by coordinated artillery, could defeat the flower of Western chivalry was almost incomprehensible to contemporary observers. Yet here was proof that the age of the mounted knight was ending. Bayezid's victories had brought him to the gates of Constantinople itself. The ancient city, reduced to little more than a city-state, survived only through the payment of tribute and the protection of its massive walls. The Sultan's armies had penetrated deep into Hungary, while his naval forces dominated the Black Sea. The Ottoman Empire had become the greatest power in southeastern Europe. But the Thunderbolt's greatest triumph also sowed the seeds of his downfall. His rapid expansion had created a vast empire that was difficult to govern and defend. More dangerously, it had attracted the attention of a new power rising in the east, known in the west as The confrontation between these two titans of the medieval world began in 13, when Bayezid's expansion into Anatolia brought him into conflict with Timur's vassals. As documented in the contemporary chronicle of the victories of Tamerlane, the aging Mongol conqueror saw the Ottoman Sultan as an upstart who had grown too powerful for his own good. The war that followed was unlike anything the region had seen since the original Mongol invasions. Timur's forces, hardened by decades of conquest across Central Asia and Persia, represented the last flowering of nomadic military power. Against them, Bayezid deployed the most advanced military machine in the Islamic world, combining traditional Turkish mobility with the latest innovations in firearms and artillery. The decisive confrontation came on July 20th, 1402, on the plains outside Ankara. Both armies represented the pinnacle of their respective military traditions. Timur commanded perhaps 400,000 men, drawn from across his vast empire. Bayezid's forces, though smaller, were better equipped and more disciplined. The battle began at dawn with a massive cavalry engagement that decided the fate of empires. Timur's tactical genius became apparent as he exploited divisions within the Ottoman ranks, turning Bayezid's own vassals against him. By evening, the Ottoman army had been annihilated, and Sultan Bayezid himself was a prisoner in Timur's hands. The news of Ankara struck the Islamic world like a thunderbolt. The seemingly invincible Ottoman Empire had been shattered in a single day, its sultan reduced to a curiosity in his captor's court. The rapid expansion that had made Bayezid's reputation had also made his empire vulnerable to a single, decisive defeat. The sound of clashing steel echoed across the blood-soaked fields of Kamalu as two brothers fought for the soul of a shattered empire. The year was 1413, and the Ottoman interregnum, that terrible decade when the greatest Islamic empire of the age nearly tore itself apart, was reaching its climactic moment. Prince Mehmed Kilebi faced his brother Musa across a battlefield littered with the corpses of their mutual subjects, each claiming the rightful throne of their captured father Bayezid the Thunderbolt. The disaster at Ankara had unleashed forces that threatened to undo 3 generations of Ottoman expansion, with Sultan Bayezid held captive in Timur's court. His 4 sons had each carved out their own territories from the ruins of the empire. Suleiman controlled the European provinces from his capital at Idlib, while Isa held sway over much of Anatolia from Bursa. In the east, Musa had established himself as the champion of the common people, while Mehmed governed the remaining Ottoman territories with the support of the traditional elite. The empire that had seemed invincible under Bayezid's rule now appeared to be following the familiar pattern of nomadic successor. States repeat expansion followed by fragmentation and collapse. Christian Europe, which had trembled before Ottoman power just a decade earlier, now watched with barely concealed glee as the Turkish Empire devoured itself. The first phase of the civil war had seen Isa eliminated by his brother Mehmed in 1403, but this victory had only intensified the conflict between the remaining clans. Suleiman, controlling the wealthy European provinces, seemed initially to hold the strongest position. His forces dominated the vital crossing points between Asia and Europe, while his treasury, fed by the tribute of conquered Balkan cities, could support extensive military campaigns. But Suleiman's strength was also his weakness. His reliance on Christian vassals and European mercenaries made him suspect in the eyes of traditional Ottoman supporters. When he was killed in 1411 while campaigning against his brother Musa, many saw it as divine judgment on a ruler who had compromised too much with the empire's enemies. The struggle then narrowed to a final confrontation between Musa and Mir, 2 brothers who represented fundamentally different visions of Ottoman destiny. Musa, known as the People's Prince, had built his power base among the common soldiers and the urban poor. He preached a return to the radical egalitarianism of early Islamic conquest, promising to redistribute the wealth of the empire's elites to those who had fought for its expansion. Mehmed, by contrast, represented continuity with the established order. He had carefully cultivated relationships with the traditional military and administrative elites, promising to restore the empire's former glory through disciplined governance rather than popular revolution. His supporters included many of the survivors from his father's court, men who had served the empire faithfully for decades. The ideological dimension of their conflict was reflected in their military strategies. Musa's forces were characterized by their fanatical devotion and willingness to die for their cause, but they lacked the discipline and organization that had made earlier Ottoman armies so effective. Mehmed's troops, while smaller in number, maintained the professional standards that had been the hallmark of Ottoman military success. The Battle of Kamalu, fought on July 5, 1413, represented more than a dynastic struggle. It was a contest for the very identity of the Ottoman Empire. As the 2 armies deployed in the morning mist, observers noted the stark contrast between them. Musa's forces advanced with the irregular enthusiasm of a popular uprising, while Mehmed's troops moved with the precision of a professional army. The battle itself was decided not by superior tactics but by superior organization. Musa's initial charge broke through Mehmed's front lines, and for a moment it seemed the People's Prince might achieve victory. But Mehmed had learned from his father's disaster at Ankara, keeping strong reserves that could respond to changing circumstances. When Musa's forces became disordered in pursuit, Mehmed's counterattack was devastating. According to the Ottoman Chronicle, the restoration of the empire, as referenced in historical accounts of the period, the death of Musa marked the end of the most dangerous phase of the With the elimination of his last serious rival, Mehmed could begin the long process of rebuilding the shattered empire. But the victory at Kamalu was only the beginning of Mehmed's challenges. The empire he had inherited was a shadow of its former self. Anatolia was devastated by a decade of civil war, while the European provinces had been reduced to a few isolated strongholds. The great fortresses that had once anchored Ottoman power were in ruins, and the military machine that had terrorized Europe lay in pieces. Perhaps most dangerous of all, the empire's enemies had not been idle during the interim. The Byzantine Empire, reduced to Constantinople and its immediate surroundings, had nevertheless managed to recover some of its lost territories. The Balkan princes, who had been reduced to vassalage by Bayezid's conquests, had reasserted their independence. Hungary and Venice had formed an alliance aimed at permanently reducing Ottoman power, yet Mehmed possessed one crucial advantage: that his rivals had lacked legitimacy. His victory in the civil war had been achieved through superior organization and discipline rather than popular demagoguery or foreign support. The traditional Ottoman elite, the backbone of the empire's administration and military, had rallied to his cause. Now they would help him rebuild what had been lost. The massive bronze cannon roared like thunder as Sultan Mehmed II watched the ancient walls of Constantinople crumble under the relentless bombardment. The year was 1453, and the young Ottoman ruler, barely 21 years old, was about to achieve what had eluded his ancestors for over a century: the conquest of the last remnant of the Roman Empire. The great city that had stood for over 1,000 years as the bull. Christianity in the East was about to fall to the forces of Islam. The transformation of Ottoman fortunes since the dark days of the interregnum had been nothing short of miraculous. When Mehmed's grandfather, Mehmed I, had reunited the empire in 1413, it had seemed almost impossible that the Ottomans could ever again threaten the major powers of Europe. The empire was bankrupt, its armies scattered, its territories reduced to a fraction of their former extent. Yet within 40 years, the Ottomans had not only recovered their lost territories but had expanded far beyond their previous boundaries. The key to this remarkable recovery lay in the institutional reforms implemented during the reigns of Mehmed I and his son Murad II. These rulers had learned from the disasters of the creating new systems of governance that could prevent future civil wars while maximizing the empire's military potential. The Devshirme system, which recruited Christian children for service in the Ottoman administration and military, had been expanded in system. The Janissary Corps, rebuilt from the ground up, had become the most feared infantry force in the world. The provincial administration had been reorganized to prevent the emergence of powerful local dynasties that might challenge central authority. But perhaps most importantly, the Ottomans had embraced military innovation with unprecedented enthusiasm. The young Mehmed II, who had ascended to the throne in 1450, was particularly fascinated by the latest developments in artillery technology. He had recruited Hungarian engineer Orban to design the massive cannon that was now reducing Constantinople's walls to rubble. The siege of Constantinople had begun on April 6, 1453, with the deployment of the largest artillery train ever assembled. The Ottoman force numbered perhaps 80,000 men, supported by a fleet of over 400 vessels. Against them, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, could muster fewer than 7,000 defenders. The disparity in numbers was overwhelming, but the defenders possessed one crucial advantage: the massive walls of Constantinople, which had protected the city for over 1,000 years. These fortifications, built by the Emperor Theodosius II in the 5th century, had withstood countless sieges. No artillery had ever been powerful enough to breach them. But Mehmed's great cannon changed everything. The massive bronze weapon, 27 feet long and requiring 60 oxen to move, could fire stone balls weighing over 1,200 pounds. When it spoke, the sound could be heard for miles, and its projectiles could smash through the strongest masonry. For the first time in history, the walls of Constantinople were vulnerable. The psychological impact of the artillery bombardment was as important as its physical effects. The constant thunder of the guns, day and night, wore down the defenders' morale while demonstrating the futility of resistance. The city's population, which had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands, had dwindled to fewer than 50,000 souls. Many of these were refugees from the Ottoman advance, trapped in the last Christian stronghold in Asia Minor. The decisive assault came on May 29, 1453, in the pre-dawn darkness. The Ottoman forces attacked simultaneously from land and sea, with the Janissaries leading the assault on the damaged walls. The final breach was achieved not through the great cannon, but through a small postern gate that had been left unlocked during the chaos of battle. As the sun rose over the Golden Horn, the double-headed eagle of Byzantium was hauled down from the walls of Constantinople, replaced by the crescent banner of Islam. Emperor Constantine XI had died fighting on the walls, his body found among the common soldiers who had made the last stand. The Roman Empire, which had endured for over 1,500 years, had finally come to an end. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves throughout Europe and the Islamic world. For Christians, it represented the loss of one of their most sacred cities, the seat of Eastern Christianity for over a millennium. For Muslims, it was the fulfillment of a prophecy attributed to the Prophet Muhammad himself, who had foretold that Constantinople would be conquered by a righteous Muslim army. Historical accounts from the period, as documented in Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, emphasize that the conquest marked more than the end of the Byzantine Empire. It represented the emergence of the Ottomans as a true world power. The empire that had nearly collapsed during the interregnum had not only survived but had achieved the greatest prize in the Islamic world. Sultan Mehmed, now known as Mehmed the Conqueror, had proven that the Ottoman phoenix had risen from the ashes of defeat. The empire that had begun as a small Beylik in the hills of Anatolia now controlled territories spanning two continents. From the Danube to the Euphrates, the conquest of Constantinople was not an ending but a beginning, the foundation for an empire that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries to come. The transformation was complete. The shepherd's dream that had begun with Osman Ghazi's vision had become reality on a scale that none of the early Ottoman leaders could have imagined. From a modest principality to a world empire, the Ottoman rise represented one of the most remarkable expansions in human history, achieved through a combination of military innovation, administrative genius, and sheer determination that would inspire and terrify the world for generations to come.